Keep yourself in the loop of everything football on the Golden State Media Concepts Football Podcast. The latest news on and off the field, be it college football, Big Ten, SEC, Big 12, Pac-12, ACC to the NFL. We've got you covered. Listen to the Golden State Media Concepts Football Podcast.
Welcome into the GSMC Football Podcast right here on the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Brice Lewis. Another jam-packed news day, time of the football off-season. Obviously, we have a lot of news and notes. Obviously, getting ready for free agency coming up here in just about almost 10 days. Also, we're going to talk about some of the top 5 quarterbacks from this year's NFL draft. So, obviously, we got some draft news in there. A little bit of CBA news and more other things, but this will probably be more of a free agency-centric episode in terms of just news going into free agency, as we will probably continue to get more news coming out of free agency, maybe some trades potentially, and so on and so forth. And we'll start with some news coming out of Jacksonville. If you watch the Jacksonville Jaguars or pay attention to their season last year, this time in the offseason, they signed Nick Foles to a 3-year, $88 million contract after what he did in Philadelphia, obviously leading to the Super Bowl, and also coming in for 2 straight playoff performances and years in a row and playing at a high level. So they felt like he was warrant that contract that he got. They also drafted a guy in the 6th round named Gardner Minshew. Gardner Minshew is a guy who obviously was not expected to do a lot when he came into the league. 6th round picks are usually just expected to maybe just be a backup guy at best. People thought that was his potential coming out of Washington State. And Nick Foles got hurt in the first game of the year. And from that game forth, Gardner Minshew came in and he played pretty well, pretty decent for what Jacksonville was last year. Basically, out of the 2 guys, you kind of looked at him and said he was the better quarterback. And one of the reasons why that was because one of the things that this is the reason why Joe Flacco and Phillip Rivers are struggling now. He's basically a sitting duck in the pocket. So unless your offensive line is elite or he'll have time, he's basically a liability offensively. Plus, obviously, you don't know if he can stay healthy. Because if he can't move around, then he'll be easy for defensive lines to get to, sack the quarterback, and then struggle. So, Gardner Minshew obviously was the most mobile one out of the 2. So this helped create the opportunity for him to come out there and basically show to the Jaguars brass that he deserves to be the starting quarterback. And it looks like with this news of him being on the trade block, they are going ahead with Gardner Minshew as the quarterback for next year. Obviously, so far with reports, there has not been very much of a substantial talking with any teams with the Jaguars regarding Nick Foles, especially with the contract that he was given. It is very unlikely that a team will go out of their way to pick up a Nick Foles. So they may be stuck with a guy that they have on the bench that they're paying about almost $29 million a year for a guy who's their starting quarterback, who they only are maybe paying $500,000 to because he was a 6th round pick. Obviously, if you could get rid of Nick Foles, this will clearly help in terms of cap room because you're able to free up some cap. And I'm sure if they cut him, there's going to be some dead money. So, which is why they're trying to hopefully get a trade potentially for him. But obviously, as you can tell, Jacksonville has themselves in a situation where, they're just in a situation where they've struggled and they haven't done as well as they should have in the last 2 years. They've underperformed. The changes have been made. They have both traded A.J. Bouye, which I'll talk about later in the show, and obviously early in the season, Jalen Ramsey. So obviously Jacksonville is going in a different direction, and obviously in this direction that they're going, like as I said, Gardner Minshew looks like he is the guy that they are deciding to be the guy who leads them at the end of the day. I am one of the big fans of Gardner Minshew. I've always been a fan of him Obviously, he kind of has the mustache, and it's Minshew mania, and all the stories about him at Washington State. And I really enjoy saying his name. I always don't want to call him just Gardner. I'm gonna call him Gardner Minshew because it just has that little pop to it when you say his last name. But that's basically the decision that Jacksonville is heading in. We'll see if maybe somebody might be willing to take Nick Foles off their hands. With this quarterback market, you never know. But I'm sure everybody would probably want to kick the bucket on every other quarterback option available before they actually look into maybe getting a Nick Foles. So, and obviously if you bring him into your team, he probably has to be at least competing for a starting job with the money you would have to take on for him, unless Jacksonville agreed to pay most of it where you're barely not getting anything hitting you in terms of cap room. So that's the news coming out of Jacksonville and their quarterback situation. But now we also go into another quarterback situation, obviously, that's been lingering this offseason all the way through this past season. This is with the Dallas Cowboys and Dak Prescott. Obviously, the deal where Dak wants about $34-35 million. Dallas doesn't want to give him. They want to give him 32-31. There's just this gap that they're trying to hit on and trying to figure out what's the best move for both of these guys, for both of these parties to make. Is there going to be a move made that will result in Dak being with them long term? Will he be franchise tagged, which he has publicly spoken about that he doesn't want, and all of that? But there are news coming out that Dak actually might want a shorter term deal, so he can hit free agency again at 29. So that would probably be about a 2 to 3 year deal for Dak. And the reason is that obviously with quarterbacks, since quarterbacks can play late into their career, obviously they say when you hit 28, you're hitting the prime of your career for most players because you have that 4 to 5 year prime gap before you start declining. Quarterbacks can still be in their prime all the way to 35, 36. So you have a much longer prime as a quarterback in today's NFL. So Dak, is interesting hearing that Dak wants to be 29, which it makes sense. It's actually a very smart business decision. If he took a 5-year deal now, he wouldn't hit free agency again maybe till he's 32, 33. Well, now teams can start to say, well, do we want to give him another big contract and he's entering maybe the end of his prime maybe, or he's getting to the end of his prime? Do we want to give him a contract and he's aging a little bit? You know what I'm saying? Like even though it's still young, the quarterback years, you are 32. Not everybody's willing to pay a 32-year-old quarterback a lot of money coming out, because especially if injuries and stuff like that happens to him and etc. So him wanting to be a free agent by 29, what that opens up for him is he can get let's say he gets $32 million for 3 years now. Like $32 million a year. So if you think about this is what Dak's doing. Obviously in 3 years, especially with Patrick Mahomes get his deal, what he gets paid now will be even more in the future. Their quarterbacks may be at that time getting $40 million a year. So Dak's basically setting himself up to basically get back into the market and to get another pay increase while still being 29, so you can't use age against him. And also, if Dak can get the Cowboys to the Super Bowl or win more playoff games or become even better of a quarterback, it will become more justified in him getting that $40 million. And so basically he's making more money now if he does it that way and is successful, instead of maybe getting that long-term deal. Because, like I said, depending on what happens during that contract length, you want to make sure that you potentially could line yourself up for more money, not lose money or be expected to take a pay cut. So honestly, what Dak's doing is very smart. It's a very smart financial decision. And we'll see if the Cowboys oblige to that. They may not want to sit here and say, oh, in 3 years or 4 years, oh, we got to pay Dak $40 million now. But if he proves himself, maybe a team will. So obviously Dak Prescott's out here making moves. He's thinking about his long-term future. He's thinking about what's best for him. And you can't blame him for that. You cannot blame Dak Prescott for that, making a business move, because this is a business, and trying to set himself to get paid the most amount of money he could potentially get paid. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that at all. So we'll have to see what happens. I'm sure people who are Dallas Cowboy fans are going to be very intrigued to see what happens over these next couple of weeks. If the Dallas Cowboys do franchise Dak, which it looks like they will right now, or will they be able to come to a deal on a contract? But coming up next and teaming on the GSMC Football Podcast, big trade between the Chargers and Panthers, trading 2 Pro Bowl offensive linemen for each other. 8 teams are interested in Tom Brady. 4 would sign him right now. And Cleveland would consider an OBJ trade if we were blown away by the right deal. All that and more news right here on the podcast.
Are you looking for help for your fantasy football team? Check out the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast. Get today's best advice on who to start, who to sit, even who you should draft. From sleeper picks to red hot lineups, they got it all covered for you. That's GSMCpodcast.com/fantasy-football-podcast. We'll cover traditional leagues, dynasty, PPR, even IDP leagues. When you need fantasy help, there's just one show to hit up. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
Welcome back to the GSMC Football Podcast. Last segment we talked about Nick Foles being on the trading block, the type of results they've been having so far looking for a trade partner, why they are putting him on the trade block, why it's going to be hard to trade him, and obviously this meaning that they're going to go with Gardner Minshew next year as their starting quarterback as far as we know going into next season. Also, I talked about Dak wanting a short-term deal. I broke down why he's doing this, why this is a money move. This is to help maximize the amount of money he can get out of his career, and putting him in the potential to also prove himself more to people around the league. So maybe when that next deal does come up around, he gets the money he definitely wants with no pushback, depending on what happens. And just going from there. But now we're going to get into some news. The Chargers and Panthers made a trade today to trade 2 Pro Bowl linemen, as the Chargers agreed to trade Pro Bowler left tackle Russell Okung to the Panthers in exchange for offensive Pro Bowl guard Ty Turner, as the 2 teams, I guess, are bolstering weaknesses of their line, you could say. You think it's kind of weird. You never really see this trade a lot in the NFL, but these are guys that they probably feel like improve their team. I'm sure some Charger fans may feel like, oh, he wasn't as good as we hoped. And maybe there's Panthers fans who feel like Turner wasn't as good as he hoped. So they feel like, well, maybe we'll get a better player now coming to our team, and we'll get somebody who can protect our quarterback better. Obviously, the Panthers are getting someone who can protect whoever the quarterback, which right now looks like it's going to be Cam Newton's blind side. Obviously, the Chargers are helping fortify the middle of their offensive line. So clearly this was a decision that was made because both teams have aspirations and things they want to do. Early trade into the season. Obviously, this deal will not become official until the new league season has been started. So, as far as we know, it will be approved and it will happen. But obviously, they have to go through the formalities, the paperwork, the actual new league year, things like that. So it will be very interesting to see what happens going forward and moving forward into the future with both of these teams. We'll see if maybe any of these other teams make any trades. Maybe we don't know. Maybe one player was getting paid less money than the other, so maybe somebody was trying to free up some cap space. We'll probably get more details about this trade a little later on, but right now this is all we know, that this trade has happened, and both teams probably feel like they're improving with this trade, and we'll have to see this year on the field if any team actually did. So now we have obviously the Tom Brady sweepstakes. Now there has been report around the league that Tom Brady is the one domino that's kind of freezing the NFL right now because nobody knows what he's going to do. It's kind of one of those things where, like I've said before, it's kind of like a Kawhi situation. you kind of don't want to make any moves because first you have to pay Tom Brady a lot of money. So you don't, and not everybody just has endless amounts of cap room. They can just say, we can give Tom Brady what he wants and still make plenty of spending on other players. You kind of have to see and wait. What is he going to do? What is he going to make his decision? Some people think that Brady has already made his decision. He's just not saying anything till it's time to. Some people think he hasn't made a decision yet, and he will definitely look at every option. Some people think he's going back to New England. This is just to see what he can leverage off of them and see if what they're willing to do, the appreciation that's been reported he wants from them, and many other things. It's a very interesting situation, I would think so, if I say so myself. And then one thing about it, too, is that Brady is in a position of power. Because everybody is trying to figure out what he's going to do. And I can understand why people think it's a domino waiting to fall. I think Brady is in a situation where I think in these situations, players have preferences. He has a preference of where he would want to go. I think Brady might want to stay in New England, but he understands it's a business. And he understands if they don't give me what I want, or I don't feel like I have my best chance to win, I have to do my due diligence and look into other places and on other teams to see if they can give me what I need, and then have to go there and do what I got to do. That's kind of the thing that you have to think about here with this decision that he has to make. Remember something about over the summer with Kevin Durant's decision. Obviously, this is basketball related, but if you were a basketball fan, the report all year was that he preferred the Knicks, but then he went to the Nets. Kawhi, people thought he wanted to go back to California. We just didn't know which LA team. People thought he was going to the Lakers, but he went to the Clippers. So it's been shown with some of the biggest stars in basketball, you may have a team that you have an initial want to go to, or an initial team that you will be looking at going to, but then it may change when it gets down to it. I'm sure Brady's going to take some interviews. I think he's going to take some calls. I think he's going to hear some teams. I think he's going to take that approach. I don't think he'll make a quick decision. I think he'll do his due diligence, hear what other teams have to say, and then think to himself, well, what do I want to do? Obviously, anybody's trying to get in there. People think the 49ers are interested. People think Cowboys should be interested. People think Chargers are interested. We've already been told that the Giants and the Colts will not pursue Tom. Those were some teams that people thought would be interested. You know, everybody is saying, why don't you look into Brady? But obviously the thing that people aren't worried about is Brady is 42, and people wonder, is he declining? A lot of teams, obviously, if 8 teams are interested and 4 are ready to sign him, if that clearly shows me that teams aren't worried about that. Because they feel like we know what we need to give Brady, a good offensive line and weapons, and we should be able to be one of the best teams in our division and in our league. Because it's the perception always in the narrative with Tom is as long as he is on your team, you always have a chance to win. So we'll have to see what happens when it comes to Tom in that decision, because this is a big decision for Tom. This team, or whoever he goes to, he'll probably end his career with. So either he can end it with the franchise who drafted him, or he can end it somewhere else in another franchise trying to go for a Super Bowl. We don't know where, and we don't know how this is going to end for Tom. But we know how Tom would want it to end. This could have a potential Peyton Manning situation written all over it. We never thought he would leave the Colts. But the Colts were an aggressive franchise and said, we're moving on because we need to think about the future. The Patriots, it feels like Bill Belichick has tried to think about the future, but Robert Kraft came in the middle of that and said, no, Brady is our guy. And now people are wondering, does Bill Belichick even want him back now? Because of the fact that he knows Brady is older and he needs to start preparing for the future instead of hanging on to the same guy who's getting older and older by the years. And in the last story, the Cleveland Browns said they are open to trading Odell Beckham Jr. if they are blown away by an offer. So this usually means they have low interest in trading him, but if a team is desperate and they want to give up a lot for him, they will definitely take a look into it and consider trading him. This means you can't just offer up a weak selection of picks or something that you feel like, wow, that was underwhelming. It's more of, listen, we're going to keep him unless y'all say that y'all want him that badly. I don't think any team's going to offer a boatload of stuff for Odell Beckham. I don't think that any team is going to do that at all. So, I think Cleveland is very content with keeping Odell. I don't think they necessarily want to get rid of Odell. So, I think they're pretty satisfied if Odell Beckham stays and sticks around. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. He's just doing what he needs to do to be successful out there. And you can't hate that. You can't hate that for him. And we'll just have to see what happens going into the future of Odell Beckham. Hopefully he has a better season than he did last year. Hopefully him and Baker can have better chemistry, and then they can have one of the best wide receiver quarterback duos in Brown history in NFL season coming up. But coming up next, Teddy Bridgewater to the Bucks. People say that the Bucks are courting him. Miami has the highest amount of cap space out of all the cap space figures that have been released. AJ Bouye was traded to the Denver Broncos. And Denver, did they get enough back in return? All that and more news right here on the podcast.
Check out the show that's built on the MMA. From the UFC to extreme cage fighting, they got the fights covered. Check out the GSMC MMA podcast. Get the latest news on past or upcoming fights. Join us as we talk to and about some of the biggest names in the MMA, past, present, and future. When it's the fight game, there's just one show to check out. GSMCpodcast.com/MMA-podcast. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
Welcome back to the GSMC Football Podcast. Last segment, we talked about the trade that was made between the Chargers and the Panthers, agreeing to trade two of their Pro Bowl linemen to each other. We also talked about the eight teams that are interested in Tom Brady. What's this mean? Why these teams are interested? What this means for Tom Brady in the league moving forward. As people say, the league is kind of right now holding on to the collective breath of what Tom Brady is going to do and freezing itself for that decision. And also, Cleveland would consider trading star receiver Odell Beckham if they get an offer that blows them away, clearly showing that, hey, if somebody wants him enough, we will consider it, but we're not just going to trade him for nothing or a little bit. We want to feel like we're getting very, very compensated for giving away one of our best players on the team. Now we're going to get into some news, obviously more quarterback carousel news. There has been a report that the Bucs are preparing to court Teddy Bridgewater when free agency comes. Obviously, this is a very big decision. Obviously, I have more news later on Jameis Winston's future with Tampa. But right now, it looks like they're looking for a new guy. Bruce Arians looks like he's doubled down and he's going to find a new quarterback. And one of the guys that he's looking at is Teddy Bridgewater. Obviously, this is in the same division of the Saints, so obviously he would be playing the Saints twice a year. Tampa seems prepared to give him the money that is needed and the cash that is needed to be their quarterback. I think that would be a great fit for Teddy. Tampa Bay has one of the best and most underrated offenses in the league, I feel like. You saw the numbers that Jameis put up in that offense. Now, we may sit here and think in terms of pure quarterback talent, that Teddy might not be better than Jameis, but he's more efficient and not turnover prone. And with the weapons of Mike Evans and Chris Godwin and Rashad Perriman, O.J. Howard, Cameron Brate, Ronald Jones Jr., all those guys. It feels like, and Bruce Arians as your head coach, quarterback whisperer, it feels like that would be a perfect place for Teddy to still be successful and play well to the point where now nobody can sit here and say, oh, he's not good enough, or he isn't as good as we thought. I mean, this is a prime position. Now, obviously, if he goes to Tampa, there's not going to be any excuses. They have an up-and-coming defense and a lot of offensive weapons. They could easily next year be one of the best teams in NFC South, if not win the NFC South next year, with the talent they have accumulated on the team. It's just about putting it all together, having a quarterback who doesn't throw 30 picks, and just making some better plays, learning how to win. So, and Tampa may feel like that. Teddy is the guy to get them to where they want to go. Teddy is the guy to get them to where they think they should be. Teddy has led a team to the playoffs before, so this isn't new to him. This isn't like he's never had done it. Obviously, if you know Teddy Bridgewater's story, he had a torn ACL he suffered, kept him out for a whole year. Minnesota let him go, and now got back into the league, played this season for the Saints, was undefeated in all his starts, played well in his starts, which is the reason why he's lined himself up for a big starting quarterback payday this offseason. And if the first visit he gives is to Tampa Bay, I think Tampa Bay feels very strongly about signing him and keeping him on the roster. Or adding him to the roster as their new starting quarterback of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. It'll definitely be an interesting sight. Because now the NFC South will have Drew Brees, Teddy Bridgewater, Matt Ryan, and Cam Newton as the four quarterbacks who are starting for them. So it'll be very interesting to see what actually happens when it comes to that situation. If Tampa Bay can pick up Teddy Bridgewater. We have heard Teddy is linked to a lot of teams. So we'll have to see, like I said, when free agency starts, who Teddy decides to give that first visit to. Because sometimes I always say that first free agent visit means that he prefers people to talk. Obviously, you know about the tampering period that you can now have before free agency. So maybe they'll be able to get there. So, like I said, it'll be very interesting to see what actually ends up happening in the long term. In other news, AJ Boye, starting cornerback for the Jacksonville Jaguars, was traded to the Denver Broncos today for a 4th-round pick. Obviously, if you know AJ Boye, he got his initial start in Houston where he became their best corner, but was going to demand a big contract in free agency, so he walked and Jacksonville paid him. Obviously, Jacksonville's defense has not been reaching expectations as they expected, and so this trade seemed like a move that they felt like they probably need to make because they're trying to restart at some positions on their team, especially on the defensive side of the ball. Now, obviously, a lot of people are wondering, AJ Boye is a starting corner in this league. Could you have gotten maybe more than a 4th? Could you have gotten a day 2 pick, a 2nd pick, mid-round pick, maybe even a 3rd? The fact that they got a 4th-round pick, a lot of people wondered, did the Jacksonville Jaguars just want to get rid of him? You know, because there's always that trade where you're like, that's all you got? Just a simply measly 4th-round pick for a starting player? You know, and I always like to say sometimes when you see that, it just shows you how badly they want to get rid of this player. They were just like, we want to get rid of AJ Boye. We do not want him on our team. And listen, Jacksonville now has accumulated a lot of draft picks now. So this just adds to the draft pick selection that they have. But there is that question of could they have gotten a little more for him? Did they try that hard to get more? Or did they just say, 4th-round pick, we'll take it? Obviously, Leonard Fournette made a joke about it on his Instagram, posting a picture of him sitting by himself empty in a room. Obviously, as a joke, obviously Jalen Ramsey is left, and their star defensive end's about to leave because he doesn't want to be there anymore. And, you know, obviously Bouye has left, and Nick Foles is about to go. And I guess a lot of the players that we know in Jacksonville are leaving. Obviously, Malik Jackson's about to leave. I mean, a lot of the players that we have known to be one of the better players on Jacksonville are leaving the Jacksonville Jaguars. And so Leonard Fournette feels like he's the only guy who's going to be there for years to come. So he's made a little joke about being alone on his social media. So that's what's going on also in Jacksonville, is they're making a lot of moves right now. And also, they released the figures for projected annual cap space, and the Miami Dolphins lead with $88 million. Obviously, last week I talked about how they're going to be very active with trade talks because they have a lot of ammunition. But they also have a lot of cap. They have close to $90 million in cap. So they have tons of money to spend to improve their team. This is going to test Brian Flores and Chris Greer and that entire front office of Miami. Because you have all the ammo. Like, honestly, with all this ammo, Miami could become a good team next year if they get the right guys. We just don't know what their plan is, what they're trying to do, and what's going to happen. Obviously, we are all expecting them, if nothing changes, for them to draft quarterback Tua Tagovailoa in the NFL draft. And obviously, we'll have to see what they decide to do with the $88 million in free agency. This usually, sometimes with teams that have a lot of cap, they tend to overspend because they have the money to overspend to make sure they get players. But we don't know if Miami will be that team that will still overspend even though they have that money. Because I always feel like you can overspend by like $5 million, maybe even 10. But you don't want to overspend by like 15, 20 million. If you start doing that, then that's when it starts looking like a bad move, especially if they don't produce. So we'll have to see what they decide to do. Obviously, if you look at Miami, they have a lot of holes. So with all this money, they have the ability to fill these holes, to fill out depth on the roster, and to accumulate enough talent so when the draft comes around, that could change their free agency plans. With all this money, you don't know who they're going to bring in. And like I said, that could change free agency plans. That could change who they draft. That could change how they maneuver. That could change if they're going to trade for somebody. It really can. And then there's a lot of teams that have that cap. Like the Colts have a lot of cap room. They're top 5 in cap room and coming into the league next year. They have a lot of room for improvement. That's one of the biggest things about this entire situation, is that a lot of teams with a lot of cap room have rooms for improvement, but you got to make sure you sign and hit on the right guys, and you don't overpay the wrong guys, or else you might set your franchise back in a few positions because you gave people the wrong money, and now it's hard to get out of a contract if he doesn't work out for you. Those are some of the issues sometimes with paying a player a lot of money. But on the next segment, 5 teams interested in Chris Harris Jr. Will the Lions trade out of the 3rd overall draft pick? And the NFL, it looks head to a lockout or a strike if the current CBA proposal fails. All that and more right here on the podcast.
Check out the show built around the women of MMA. From the UFC to the extreme cage fighting, we got the fights covered.
Listen.
It's the Golden State Media Concepts Women's MMA Podcast. The latest news of upcoming fights, discussions of previous matches. Join us as we talk to and about the biggest names in women's mixed martial arts, past, present, and future. When it's the women's fight game, you know where to listen to. The Golden State Media Concepts Women's MMA Podcast.
Welcome back to the GSMC Football Podcast. Last segment, we talked about Teddy Bridgewater being courted by the Buccaneers. It sounds like the Bucs are prepared to go and get Teddy Bridgewater to become their new starting quarterback when free agency begins. We'll have to see what happens. We also talked about AJ Bouye getting traded to the Denver Broncos. Did the Jacksonville Jaguars want to get rid of him badly, which is why they took the 4th round pick? Or was this really the value they were looking for? Obviously, because some people questioned, did they get enough back for the trade? Obviously, those were one of those types of trades. And also, we talked about Miami Dolphins having the highest amount of cap space. Obviously, we talked about before with them having a lot of draft picks and being active, but obviously they also have the cap space to formulate the team. And this Miami Dolphins team will probably be very, very different from what you saw this past season with all the ammo they have this off season. Now we're going to get some more news and notes around the league. Chris Harris Jr., excellent slot nickel corner, who has played on the Denver Broncos, won a Super Bowl with the Denver Broncos and other teams beforehand. has 5 teams interested in him going into free agency. Obviously, Chris Harris Jr., a little bit older now, but still considered one of the best nickel corners in the game. He is currently on the market and currently has 5 teams who are interested in his services. There have been players and teams that have been discussing maybe teaming up with him. Obviously, we were something earlier this offseason with Darius Slay. Obviously, potentially going where Chris Harris is, or if he comes to the Lions or something like that. I think it's very interesting. A nickel corner in this league is very underrated. Because since you're not a number 1 corner going against your number 1 receiver, people like to always say, oh, you're not the best corner in your team. But sometimes your nickel corner is the best corner in your team. Chris Harris Jr. can play outside if he needs to. He's just known to play inside. That's just his position. But he has been a number 1, number 2 corner in this game. But he's just one of the best in the business at being a nickel corner. And, he's the guy who defends that. Usually the slot receiver is usually, I like to say, sometimes the more shiftier receiver, because they're trying to get in and out of routes, and they're more of the guy who tries to get in the middle of the field to get open or first down or on the sticks a lot. So I always like to say you need a guy who can keep up with guys like that. And Chris Harris Jr. has been doing it for years. It's one of the reasons why when they got to Denver, they became one of the best defenses the year that they won the Super Bowl, because of him and Khalid Talib and all of them being in that secondary. It was hard to make anything happen. I think they called themselves the no-fly zone at that time, because they were one of the hardest teams to pass on, because obviously Denver had that ferocious pass rush, and then they had the secondary just in case the pass rush didn't show up one time. So obviously that really affected some things, and it just made things a very interesting sight and decision. So it'll be interesting to see who actually decides to go out and get a guy like Chris Harris Jr., who decides to make him a part of their team, their roster, and, just make things happen. Will the Lions potentially trade out of the 3rd overall draft pick in this year's draft? That is a big question for Detroit. Obviously, the reason why this question is big is because of the whole Tua Tagovailoa situation. There's been a lot of talk that a lot of quarterbacks, a lot of teams are interested in him. Obviously, like I've told you, Miami's interested. Some people think the Chargers potentially, maybe the Colts, could potentially trade up to that number 3 spot to acquire him, because that might be the spot that you have to get Tua. Some people think he won't drop lower than number 3. Not because the Lions are going to draft him, but just because they feel like a team will come up and get him. But the question also is are the Lions really going to trade the pick? That's a real question. I'm sure the Lions have even had probably initial talks with teams about it. They have said they're open for business, and I believe they are. But it's one thing being open for business, and another actually getting a deal that you feel like is good enough to take to then trade such a high draft pick. You want to make sure you're getting tons of compensation back in return for something like that. And so it'll be very interesting to see what happens. I think if you're Detroit, you have a lot of needs. So trading back wouldn't be the worst thing in the world to do if you find a deal that works for you. I'm sure all the way leading up to the draft, they will continue to be in discussions with people to see what the best move is for them. I'm sure, obviously, since they're experts and they're professionals, if they don't make a trade, they'll lock in on a player that they want to draft at number 3. But if they do trade, they'll have other players they would want at lower positions, just in case maybe that player they would have wanted to lock in at number 3 disappears. And so we would have to really see what happens in that situation going into it. They have a lot of, they have the leverage right now. A lot of teams want to get into that spot. They could, if they're smart, they could use that as a bidding war. Well, Chargers, this is a good deal, but Miami offered us this, so this is technically better than your deal, but if you're willing to give us this and this, we'll be willing to give you the pick instead. Kind of, playing off of each other to make sure they can get a better deal or the bestest possible deal potentially made. So that's going to be the interesting equation, situation that will be presented to them. But again, if they don't find something that they like enough, I'm sure Detroit will be more than happy to stay at that pick and make a selection, because any pick of this selection probably will help them. It's just you obviously entertain the trade because you know people are going to want to trade up, and also you know it's never a bad thing to acquire more picks for the future and for your team when it comes to potential successors that you could have in the future coming up. You know, just stuff like that. And lastly, the NFL lockout has been reporting. The NFL CBA talks is likely headed to a lockout or a strike if this current CBA proposal is not passed by with the players. Obviously, this is big news because obviously we don't want this as the fan. But also, this is the business, and this is where the business side comes up. Obviously, a lot of star players have came out against this proposal. But the NFLPA, the Morris Smith, and some players, even off the top of the Green Bay Packers, came out and said, well, this is good for our core players. This is good for a lot of our players that are in the league. Because not everybody's a star. But there are a lot of core players, and they think it's good for them. So, obviously, if it doesn't pass, I'm sure after the response that the players have also given to this, especially the star players, they're going to probably be in a very strong negotiating mood. I think the star players and a lot of players who are against it are trying to urge other players who maybe are on the fence. Don't be afraid to say no. Don't be afraid to do a lockout. Don't be afraid to do a strike. If you need help with financials, I got you. Don't be scared to fight for what's best for everybody. And we'll have to see if it works. Obviously, again, like I said, as a fan, you don't want this because you don't want to miss football. You don't want to not know if your team's going to be able to pick up guys or make signings or make trades or make things happen and stuff like that. You don't really want to do any of those things. You kind of going to get in the situation you're just going to hope for the best. And I think it's going to be a very interesting situation if this does fail, because that might also mean if they're saying this, the players in the NFLPA may not be planning to negotiate further this offseason. Obviously, since the offseason is really about to start, and obviously the players are going to worry about other things like camp, contracts, trades, like stuff like that, draft. That'll be more of their concern than the negotiation. So, if it's not locked up and figured out by the time the new draft year begins, it looks like it probably will not be talked about again till next offseason, which now puts everything kind of in limbo when it comes to next offseason and moves that could potentially be made and etc. So obviously we'll have to keep an eye on that. Obviously when news comes out, we will definitely talk about it on here on this podcast. And we will discuss either if we're going to be screaming for joy because they agreed on it and we know we're going to get football for sure next year, or we're going to be talking about what's next if they decide to decline the potential offer that has been offered to them by the NFL owners. But coming up next, Jameis Winston likely leaving Tampa Bay, where he might go. The Pats plan to draft a quarterback regardless of Tom Brady's decision, and CBS agrees to extend one of their best, if not their best analyst, Tony Romo, over $17 million a year. All that and more right here on the podcast.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
back to the GSMC Football Podcast. Last segment, we talked about many things, like 5 teams being interested in the older but still good nickel corner Chris Harris Jr. Obviously, he's getting plenty of interest from NFL teams on potentially signing with them, adding into their secondary, and bolstering their defenses in the back end. We also discussed, would the Lions really trade out of the 3rd overall draft pick? They have plenty of options. They have leverage because a lot of teams want to trade up to get Tua. So they might be able to get a deal they cannot turn down. But I also feel like Detroit will also be very content with keeping the 3rd overall draft pick and making a selection if they can't find a trade that they really actually want. And then obviously, lastly, we talked about the NFL heading currently to a lockout or a strike if this current CBA actually ends up failing and falling through, which is what we all hope does not happen, but we'll have to see what actually happens when the vote comes right before this new annual league year starts. So now we're going to talk about Jameis Winston. Obviously, Jameis Winston's been a big topic for a lot of people. Obviously, we know about his 30-30 season, 30 touchdowns, 30 picks. And there's been a report that Jameis is likely leaving the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. And obviously, I talked about earlier in the show how they were interested in Teddy Bridgewater. It looks like Tampa Bay is preparing to go ahead and move on without Jameis Winston. So Jameis Winston may be preparing to go ahead and move on from Tampa Bay. Obviously, we've discussed some teams that have been interested in the past. Maybe the Colts, Chargers, potentially. Other teams potentially interested in Jameis Winston. Jameis Winston is a guy who is one of the better players in the league in terms of talent. But in terms of production, well, he's productive for both teams. And that's his biggest issue. That's been the biggest issue for him. And Jameis is kind of a guy who you feel like he's been in the league this long. You kind of know what he is. Some people think, with that LASIK eye surgery, maybe he might reduce those interceptions and increase those touchdowns, but we don't really know until he hits the field. But he is a guy who will be still around. He will probably be starting for an NFL team next year, I expect. We just don't know who. I'm sure Jameis, we've seen flashes of the talent and production that he can post up in terms of a positive production. And it could be up there with one of some of the best quarterbacks in the game. It's just getting him to be more consistent and turn the ball over less. So it's going to be important to see what happens with Jameis moving forward into the future. I'm sure Jameis might take his time. And honestly, it also depends on who's willing to pay Jameis. I'm sure Jameis is still looking to get paid as a starting quarterback, which means at least probably 25, maybe million plus. And is a team willing to pay Jameis Winston $25 million plus to potentially get another 20, 25, 30 interception season? That's a decision and a question that these teams have to make. And I'm sure they will go through every option potentially out here. This quarterback market is very fluid. Many different quarterbacks are on the market, so this isn't just a guarantee for Jameis. So we'll have to see who actually values Jameis the most, because it seems like Tampa is not going to make that deal. I mean, there was even a report that they might have even franchised Jameis, and it looks like they're not even going to franchise him. So I'm sure since they're letting him hit free agency, they're preparing for him to leave, but they're also preparing to get someone else to replace him. And I'll be interested to see what Jameis' options are when it gets to that point, who he likes and who he thinks he can be most successful with, since Tampa Bay is probably going to end up letting him walk and leave out of Tampa and him joining a new franchise and a new team to potentially, continue his career with and potentially have a career going into the future moving forward. So we'll have to see what happens in Jameis Winston's situation. We'll have to see where he ends up going. And we will know if this was a good decision for his career, obviously, by the end of this year. Or we'll know if Jameis Winston is truly what some people may think that he is, which is a bust at quarterback. Sometimes just some players just need scenery, new areas to reinvent themselves and to be better. But we'll see what happens with Jameis Winston coming into this season and where he ends up in free agency. Now, obviously, we talked about the Patriots and Tom Brady and his decision, but we're also talking about things from the Patriots' perspective. The Patriots are planning on drafting a quarterback regardless of what happens with Brady, regardless if he stays or goes. Obviously, with the type of franchise that they are, you would expect this. Obviously, they were set back from that perspective when Robert Kraft made Bill Belichick trade Jimmy Garoppolo. And, the Patriots have drafted quarterbacks over the years. And I'm sure Bill Belichick has looked at some of these guys and it's just like, I don't see them being the guy after Brady. Jimmy Garoppolo was really the only guy he really felt like could be the guy after Brady, but just didn't work out. There's a lot of lower end quarterbacks maybe. I have actually said in the past before, don't be surprised if they maybe draft a guy like Jake Fromm. Maybe a guy like Jacob Eason. Maybe even some people think maybe a guy like Jordan Love if he drops low enough. Obviously they're going to draft a guy probably to back Brady up or whoever the quarterback is. Because Jarrett Stidham's still on the roster, and if Brady does not come back, he will probably be in the mix for starting. But whoever they draft will probably also be in the mix for starting. And if Brady comes back, then he'll be in the mix for the top backup position. I think a lot of people don't think Jarrett Stidham could do the job, which I think is another reason why they're also looking to get another guy in there, just to have competition to see if they can maybe get a guy that can come out already and produce. Remember, because New England's good every year, so they're never in the top picks, so they can select, for sure, quarterback, where you just like all the talents in the world, and now you're putting him with Bill Belichick, and we'll see if this works. It's kind of like they're having to draft guys that you have to develop, and you'll have to see if it actually works for them coming into it, and if everything just ends up being a very successful situation for a lot of people going into the future. So we'll have to see what decisions are actually made in regards to that decision with the Patriots. I'm sure they're doing their due diligence, scouting every quarterback in this draft and seeing who do they think can fit with New England, who can develop into maybe a potential starting quarterback after or when Brady leaves. So, New England's always been a franchise that likes to look ahead to be prepared for the future, especially Bill Belichick, and he has to do it again, and let's see if we can get it right on this attempt and see if they can find a guy that they think can maybe be the guy for the next few years, decade. We'll have to see. And lastly, CBS has decided to extend Tony Romo. Obviously, Tony Romo's contract was up with CBS. Tony Romo has developed himself into one of the best NFL color commentators in the industry, with his amazing ability to predict what a team is about to do, his plays, things like that. That's obviously why a lot of people love him. He's not overbearing to a lot of people. A lot of people love Tony Romo commentary. He was going to be offered a lot by ESPN, about 15, 16, 17 a year. He was offered a lot by Fox. CBS ended up giving him $17 million a year to stay. Obviously, this is one of the biggest contracts for a color commentator. I always like to say it helps when you're a former athlete, because, you could be just as good as Tony Romo, but you really won't even see money like that till you're like super old and you've been in it for like 20, 30 years, where a guy like Tony Romo can just step in 2 years later and now get $17 million. Because, these guys are not just the normal guy who's getting into that position. It's a guy who's played, he's been a part of the game, and then he has excellent color commentating skills, which now makes the company have to go above and beyond to give him the money necessary for him to come back and stay with them and see what happens going into the future. So obviously, if you're a fan of Tony Romo, you will continue to hear his amazing voice on CBS, calling the biggest games that CBS has, and being able to enjoy him and his commentary over there. So that's how it is going into it. But coming up next, though, we're going to get into some draft talk. I'm going to break down the top 5 quarterbacks, in my opinion, in this draft, what I think about each guy, what I think about their potential future in the NFL coming up. And maybe if there's enough time, I might give you a guy who is a dark horse out of the quarterback class also. All that and more right here on the podcast.
This is your ultimate stop for everything sports. The Golden State Media Concepts Sports Podcast. Should I say more? From the NFL, MLB, the NBA to MMA, it's all in here. The Golden State Media Concepts Sports Podcast. Listen now.
Welcome back to the GSMC Football Podcast. Last segment, we talked about Jameis Winston likely leaving the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Obviously, Tampa Bay is starting to prepare for the departure of Jameis Winston. And so Jameis Winston probably needs to prepare to look at teams that he may want to go to. There have been teams that have been said to be interested in Jameis Winston, and we'll have to see who's willing to pay Jameis Winston starting quarterback money. Also, we talked about the Patriots being prepared to potentially draft the quarterback, probably will draft the quarterback in this year's draft to try to, make sure they have a guy for the future if Brady leaves, or even if he does stay, they're still planning to draft a quarterback. And just make sure that they're in good shape going into their future of the franchise. And also, we talked about CBS extending Tony Romo, and obviously, he's probably the best color commentator in all of broadcasting football in terms of professional. I'm sure in college, Dennis Johnson has that, even though he is not very much appreciated by a lot of people, but everybody knows how great his calls are. And so on and so forth, as Tony Romo picks $17 million a year. So now I'm going to break down my top 5 quarterbacks in this year's NFL draft. We're going to do this as a weekly thing. Obviously, on the Monday show of my man Ethan, we break down the divisions. Now, I'm doing something leading up to the NFL draft where I'll break down top 5 players at every position weekly leading up to that draft, the draft that comes up in April. And obviously, we're going to start with the quarterbacks right now. These are my personal opinion 5 guys. Some people may have these all 5. Some people may not. I'm going to start from 5 and move all the way up to 1. Or actually, no. I'm going to start from 1 and go all the way up to 5. Now, in my opinion, number 1 quarterback in this draft class is Tua Tagovailoa. To me, Tua Tagovailoa has the most talent currently out of all the quarterbacks. And the only reason why a lot of people have him 2 to Joe Burrow is because Joe Burrow has had single-handedly one of the greatest seasons in college football history. But also because of his injury, his hip injury. Obviously, it was discussed, if you watched any of the NFL draft coverage, that it really wasn't the ankle injuries that concerned anybody. It was the hip injury that makes people hesitant. So, to me, I feel like if Tua never got hurt, I would honestly have called him the safest pick in this draft. And obviously, with the injury, it's hard to say that now. You could say he's the most riskiest player in this draft. But obviously, you can see how many teams are fighting for his services. Obviously, Miami's in the driver's seat right now, but you never know who's going to try to put themselves into the driver's seat to draft Tua. I think Tua obviously showed in SEC play with Alabama that, even against some of the best defenses, he can light them up. He can play. Obviously, Alabama had one of the best receiving corps in the nation, and he took advantage of it. It wasn't like at LSU before Joe Burrow, where receivers at LSU always had wide receivers, but they just never had good quarterbacks. Now, with Alabama and Tua, they had the wide receivers and they had the quarterback and they lit it up, and that's why literally you had to almost score 40 to even have a chance of beating Alabama. And Tua really showed out when he needed to show out and played at a very, very high level on most occasional nights. And, it was a shame he got hurt, but I think he's the guy who is the best in this class. And whoever gets him, I think if Tua stays healthy, has them a potential franchise quarterback for the next decade. The second best quarterback in this draft to me is Joe Burrow. Joe Burrow this year has had single-handedly one of the greatest seasons, if not the greatest season by a player. One thing that separates him from the rest is that his anticipation and his positioning. The one thing about Burrow, if you watched him play this year, you always felt like he always made the right throw. He always made the great throw. He always made the accurate throw. He always read the right defense. He made the right decision. he was a guy, it just seemed like every way he placed the ball was always the right placement. And he used every weapon that was afforded to him at LSU and took advantage of it, and that's why they were one of the greatest offensive teams in college football. They really sat here and picked you apart. You know, and I think that was a very complete team that Ed Orgeron had out there at LSU, and Joe Burrow was just a perfect man to run the ship. Obviously, again, I think this past season shows you how important it is to be put into the right system. They ran a system his first year there that he played okay in, but did not play the best. Then they got into a system that he was recruited for, and then he had one of the greatest seasons ever. It kind of just shows you see it in the NFL, if you get the right coach and the right offense with the right player and the right skill set, that quarterback can make it in this league. And they can play at a high level. So, Burrow, I think, is just another example of that, and it shows. Their best quarterback in this draft, to me, is Jordan Love. I think Jordan Love is obviously, he's one of those guys you consider very raw, but has the most long-term talent in this draft. He has great arm strength, great arm talent, probably has the best arm talent in this draft also, which is why a lot of teams are intrigued by Jordan Love because of that fact that he kind of reminds people of Patrick Mahomes. Patrick Mahomes, when he came out in the Deshaun Watson draft and Mitchell Trubisky, had the most long-term talent in that draft and had the best arm talent in that draft. But he was raw. He came from a system at Texas Tech was just throw it all over the place. And the thing about that offense is basically that's what Kansas City runs. Throw it all over the place. We'll give you the weapons. Just make the right reads and throw it all over the place and show your arm talent. And literally, you've seen it with your own eyes. Like, the play was excellent. They played at an extremely high level. And obviously, Utah State, obviously isn't a big program. Nobody ever thinks big-time recruits or big-time players come out of those type of colleges, but he did. His junior year his sophomore year really put him on the map. He had a great year. That obviously junior year did not have the best. Obviously, a lot of things could be attributed to it. They lost a lot of offensive starters. Offense changed. Head coach changed. Offensive coordinator changed. So obviously, with all those changes, a lot of things can happen. But even with all that, we know when you put him again in the right place, in the right system with the right players, he has the potential to be great. And I think that's why a lot of teams are interested in maybe drafting him. We don't know if he'll start this year at all, but I think people definitely look at him as a potential franchise quarterback for the long term, who maybe just needs a year of sitting behind, like Patrick Mahomes, and then getting an opportunity to run the show. Number 4 on this list for me is Justin Herbert. I like Herbert a lot. Herbert is a guy, 6'6", can run, can throw, has decent arm talent. A guy who a lot of scouts just for some reason it's like you should feel like he's the number 1 overall quarterback, but for some reason you just can't get yourself to see him in that way. Just something about him at Oregon just did not make people believe this man is just an instant we need to get this man, even though he's a top 5 quarterback in this draft and probably will be a top 10 selection. I just think a lot of people just aren't sold on him. I just think a lot of people aren't sure about him. I think Justin Herbert had a great day at the Combine. I think he'll have probably a great pro day, and he's going to do everything he can to get people to not have those convictions, but we'll have to see what actually happens with Justin. We'll have to see what happens with him going into it long term. The last quarterback on my list, coming at number 5, is Jacob Eason. Jacob Eason is one of the quarterbacks who have one of the better arm talents in this draft too. He has a strong arm. Always had a strong arm coming out of high school. Obviously, if you followed his career, went to Georgia. Lost his job to Jake Fromm, who's also in this draft. Then went to Washington, had the city year, but played 7-5 record, but played well. Another guy who people think could potentially be a starter in this league or a top end backup. He has the talent to be that. It really just depends on development, coaching, and what happens. I think, you feel like with his arm talent, if things work out well, he could pretend to be a potentially good starter in this league. We just don't know. We'll have to see what situation he's drafted into. He's a guy that I said you might have to look out, maybe potentially New England. They might look at a guy like Jacob Eason and want him to be part of their team and think he could potentially be the guy going forward. So we'll have to see what happens, but he is my 5th quarterback in my list of top 5 quarterbacks, and that was my breakdown of the top 5 quarterbacks, in my opinion, in this year's NFL draft. And that's all we all here at the podcast. You were listening to the GSMC Football Podcast. I was your host, Brice Lewis. Hope you turn into the next show. And please don't forget to follow us on social media, on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Thank you, and have a good day.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Football Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.